Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Chief Operating Officer for Leidos Health Group, Mike Jackman.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here on behalf of Leidos, who is a proud supporter of the Red Cross and a sponsor of the event. We also have a board member in the National Capital Region, part of the Red Cross, John Rawle, who I actually work for. So it's great to be here. A little bit about Leidos. Leidos is a technology company that works on solutions for civil, intelligence, defense, and healthcare. And our goal is to make people safer and the world more efficient where we can. I specifically spend my time in healthcare. That's my passion. That's what I've done for many years. And I'm the COO of the health group. And the Leidos Health Group focuses on providing better access to healthcare, lowering cost of healthcare, as well as things that few people know about, like a life sciences project where we're discovering and developing the vaccine that will prevent Ebola. With that, I'd like to introduce, though, the purpose of our panel, which is to focus on the best practices and how do we become better prepared in these disasters from a behavioral point of view. How do individuals and families plan better? And with that, I'd like to introduce our guests, Dr. Marco Palma, who is a behavioral economist from Texas A&M University, and Rawle Andrews, who is a regional VP of the AARP. And I'd like to start by asking Marco a question. And as you know, the Red Cross, right, has a tagline: make a plan, build a kit, and stay informed, right? What is your opinion on how do we get individuals to be better prepared, and tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I'm a behavioral economist. First of all, thank you to John, Linda, for inviting me to be here. It's great to be here with so many people that are doing so much at the worst possible circumstances in our nation and across the globe. I'm going to try to give you about 5 things that are sometimes crucial in our decision making, but sometimes we pay very little attention. These are things that might happen at the unconscious level that really drive our decisions, and they might limit our ability to take action or ability to not do something. So the first one is about the power of context and the power of perception. This is so powerful that let me tell you a story about McDonald's and how McDonald's decided, because of health reasons, to ban trans fat from the French fries. Now, those of you who have ever eaten at McDonald's know that McDonald's has been around for a long time. And so they didn't just do it all at once in all restaurants all over the world. They actually did it in different regions of the country at different times, so they could understand what was the potential impact of banning these trans fats from the French fries. You know what happened was everybody started complaining, all the customers, that the French fries were not good anymore. They didn't taste any good, even in the restaurants that did not make the switch. So this is the power of perception, is what sometimes we believe perception becomes reality. And it becomes reality in different ways. So another interesting concept that we see is social validation. There's a very classical experiment that Ash conducted in the 50s, where he asked individuals to look at 3 different lines and asked them which of these 3 lines is closer in length to another line that was present there. There was less than 1% errors. Everybody got it right. Now, he did the exact same experiment, but this time, instead of having individual decisions, he looked at group behavior. And the way he did it is he asked some Confederates, about 4 or 5 people, to go behind the actual participants. And he asked them, which of these lines? And the first person came and said, it's line A. The second person came and said, it's line A, even though it was the wrong line. So after so many people, 3 or 4 people did this, do you know what happened, which was very powerful? About 37% of the people went for the ultimately wrong line. What this experiment tells us is that we are sometimes willing to incur in a cost and to be wrong, to be socially valid. And so this is pretty important because in many cases, we listen to remarks, there are not enough donations, we don't have enough people doing this action. Most Americans do not have enough savings to withstand a financial crisis. Most Americans are not prepared, and so on. So what are we communicating to the public? That the general idea, you are with the critical mass. So it might be fine, it is safe to be in the status quo, which is not being prepared. If we communicate on the other way that is socially valid and highlight from a framing perspective that there are differences in this social validation, we might get actually some people to take action. The third thing I want to talk about is information and how information sometimes it is very useful, we all know that, but it might get to the point that people get overwhelmed by the amount of information. So there's this concept called the choice paradox. Let me tell you an example. How many of you have a streaming movie service like Netflix? Now, if you're like me, how many of you have been in the situation where even with these very clever algorithms that look at your taste and what movies you like and so on, how many of you have been in the situation where you say, there's absolutely nothing on Netflix? Now, how is it possible that with thousands and thousands of titles that we cannot find something that we enjoy? And some researchers have shown in different contexts that when we have way too much information, that actually creates something in our brains that stops us from making a decision. This is crucial because in many situations, when we overwhelm the public with information about the different variables they have to take in consideration to purchase insurance, or the information is too complex, what happens is that people usually say, I am going to take this information, I'm going to go back home, I'm going to study it to make a decision. But when do they ever make the decision? Never, right? And so we have to be able to, yes, provide a lot of information, but provide it in a way that is very simple for people to make a decision or to make a choice. How do we do that? Hopefully in a couple of minutes I'll bring this back and use these concepts of social validation and simplicity of information for people to make choices. But it is in our raw human nature to do this concept of probability weighing. What that means is that we're overly optimistic about events that we want to happen, but that usually happen with low probability. So everything else being equal, we think that we're a lot more likely to win the lotto than the actual probability of winning the lotto. But we also, on the other hand, think that the probability that disaster will happen to us is much lower than it actually is. And most of us live somewhere in the middle. So using information that will allow people to still make a choice, but at the same time use the architecture of decision making. So if we can ask individuals, tell me a few things about yourself, about your family. What is it that, how many kids do you have? And so on. And then we can tell them, people like you are most likely to purchase this type of insurance. Or people in your neighborhood is already ready for this disaster preparedness. That provides some social validation context that will make a big difference. The last thing I want to talk about is this concept of episodic prospection. And what we do in episodic prospection is we make people pre-experience something. So if you go back to Charles Dickens' story, when Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by three ghosts, the ghost of the Christmas past make him melancholic and sad. But ultimately, he does not change the behavior in looking at the past. I think that one recurring theme that we have seen today is that most of us, or a lot of people in the panels, have discussed that whenever we experience a disaster, it is transformational. And it makes us make different decisions. Because we human beings have to rely on that experience. Just like Ebenezer Scrooge, he did not change when he looked at the past. He did not change when he looked at the present. It was only when he was facing the prospect of the Christmas yet to come that he was able to change his present. So today we live in a world that we may have the technology and the resources in virtual reality and in some other domains that might be helpful for people to pre-experience these potential risks to their health, to their well-being, and to their finances that might make them more likely to adopt some of the practices. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. Yeah. Let me turn it over to Rawle. And Rawle, what considerations do you see most critical for preparedness, especially for people who have access issues and functional issues, and perhaps with your AARP background and everything else? Can you go into that? Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. If you don't remember anything anybody said today, hearken unto this. Composure is going to get you victory in a time of national disaster or man-made disaster. It's about composure, that feeling of being calm, confident, and in control. If we can harness that feeling of being calm, confident, and in control, we're going to better navigate and weather the storms when they come. The storms, whether they're natural or man-made, are more frequent. I don't have to tell anybody in this room that. They're more intense than they've ever been, and they're more devastating. And yet, despite what Dr. Palma tells us, we don't do anything differently. So what you can do, here is one thing everybody can do. Even those folks who only ride the subway, even those folks who only do Uber and Lyft, from time to time you are a driver. And every now and again you have a designated driver, and if you're a real muckety-muck, you got a paid driver. I don't care what you do, but if you want to lock into composure, don't ever let your gas tank go below half a tank. Period. Because I can assure you the gas station's going to be crowded and they're going to run out of gas. So you can do that, and it doesn't matter what you do, but at least you have peace of mind. It starts building you towards composure. There are 40 million caregivers in the United States. 1 in 5 of those caregivers for an older adult or a frail or disabled individual lives more than an hour away from the person for whom they provide care. More than an hour away. Last May, Mike, I was at the United Nations, and you can look into the Long Island area of New York borough from the United Nations building. And it was a blue sky day just like this. And we were talking about global disaster preparedness. Nothing worse than a blue sky day to drive out all of the good work that comes from a summit like this. Because everybody came here and you had protocols, you had procedures, and none of us were thinking, what if happens? None of us were. Then we had the sound with Dr. Sims, and here's how we got composure. The reason why nobody jumped out of their seats and ran out of this venue, well, I think most of us who've been here more than 30 years know how contained this building really is. It was the biggest hole I ever saw 30 years ago when they started building it. But the reality of it is we figured out quickly what was happening. We knew there was some AV issue, and so we got calm. We got confident, we stayed in our seats, we were in control. So the first thing you're going to do, you're going to get that gas tank over half all time. Now, I'm not a backpack guy, but I did bring what I want to have for you and your families and those older and frail. Get you a home preparedness kit, right? So all of y'all got backpacks. Some of y'all recycle them. Some of you throw them away. Some of you, like me, that's not really my look. Don't let ego get you caught in a bad situation. So here's what's in the backpack. So if you are an AARP member or you come to AARP events, you might be able to get you a branded kit. It's already ready to go. Grab and go. You just shove it in here. There's nothing in here that's perishable. It's ready to go. You got some foodstuffs that are non-perishable. You got some hygiene type things for at least 2 or 3 days, sparing use. And don't rinse and repeat, just rinse. And then the last piece is you want to have some stuff that could power these devices. Now raise your hand if you got your smart device with you. Keep your hand raised if you got your power backpack or your setup battery in case this thing goes out of juice. See, we're losing some hands. These are easy things to do. And so there's no right or wrong, folks. It just is. Now, if you're not an AARP person, whether you should be or not, just create your own little pack. It doesn't really matter. It's all the same stuff. Everybody has these Ziploc bags at home, particularly those of us who have kids. And they can find all kinds of creative things to put in these things. But here it is, plus, because of coronavirus, Dr. Palma, got the mask in here that I just inserted last night for those of you, and this is corona-proof. But these are the kind of things that I want you to keep in mind, but it's all about composure. And then the last thing I need you to keep in mind is you need to have a plan that's communicated. How do we hardwire a fire drill mentality around macro preparedness? In December of 1958, some of you know, but all of you should know, there was a great fire at a Catholic middle school in Chicago, Our Lady of Angels fire. 92 students died, and 3 nuns perished, and nobody was talking about fire drills. And not only did they realize that everybody was trapped on the 2nd floor of that school when they did the after-action assessment, what they also realized is some of the permitting that went into place in terms of how we build our schools and our public spaces didn't really have preparedness built in it. So people knew where the evacuation sites were, but there was no easy ingress or egress to get there. So when you put your plan together, when you put your pack together, when you get your smartphone together, are you communicating that to each other? We all saw a tragedy over the weekend with 9 people perished who had plans to be here today. Did those folks have a single point of contact that everybody knew to call to check in to make sure they were okay or that they weren't on that? Do you have, Daniel Flores, a single point of contact, or are you the single point of contact that everybody has to know, whether you're emailing, whether you're texting, whether you're tweeting, whatever, Facebook check-ins, whatever it is, who is that single point of contact? And that person knows they're the single point of contact. So again, composure, that feeling of being calm, confident, and in control, and the understeps that are necessary to take. So you're gonna have your plan, you're gonna know your plan, you're gonna think and talk about your plan. In between the Super Bowl commercials that we all love so well, let's just make sure everything happens, that we know where we're gonna go from here if that happens. All right, then get your kit together. Again, if you want the AARP kit, get with me after the program. If you don't want an AARP kit, do it yourself. Make your own kit, right? DIY. It's all good. But the last thing is strategic communications. I know you know this in business. I know you know this at home. You may or may not be the CEO of your organization. You may not even be the CEO of your own house. But you, ladies and gentlemen, are the CEO of your life. And we cannot guarantee victory, but what we can do is increase the odds of uncertainty so we can have success and come here 364 days from now, Linda Mathis, and all of us have done one thing I've said. Not all, but one thing I've said, that we're stronger, better, more capable, and ready to go in terms of whatever the next disaster is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rawle. So, Marco, I grew up in Nicaragua. I lived in an earthquake, was not prepared at all. You know, it destroyed my city. Then I moved to Florida and I got hit by Irma. All of us have a story like that, right? You know, what are we learning about these things, and how can we, you know, better prepared? I obviously I'm proud to be in this country now, which is much better prepared than almost things, but.
So I think that there is this idea of the 6 degrees of separation. And the more that we understand how disaster happens and the closer that we get to it, the more likely we might be to do something. But in many cases, we human beings just navigate with the flag of status quo. We're very comfortable going back to what we know, to our defaults. And so sometimes it's not really our fault in the sense that we want to change, we want to implement something, but we say we're going to do this tomorrow because we always care more about today than we do about tomorrow. So everything else being equal, this is a concept in behavioral economics called present bias, which means, well, the problems of today are more tangible to me, and so I'm going to do whatever it takes to try to deal with these problems before I have to implement something new. And so it's an evolutionary biology. It's in our brains. You see, the survival of hunters and gatherers dependent on not changing. Because changing meant that you could go out to hunt, but yes, it also means that you went out and potentially be exposed to more danger. So our brains have given us these reward mechanisms to make sure that we stay in what we feel is comfortable to us, and that the zone of comfort actually inhibits our probability to change. And so this is what really compounds this potential problem. We've run some experiments in our laboratory settings and in other settings where people are willing to pay money to avoid information. Yes. So in many different contexts, whether it's they want to know who is the recipient of a donation, or if they want to know the actual probability of some bad event occurring, so they can see if they can buy insurance in our lab. And in many cases, they say, I prefer to pay $1 and not really know. Especially if what they think doesn't align or with what they hope. And so it's a very complex dynamics. But I think that trying to engage the public in making sure that we provide information about the potential tangible cost of doing that will make people get into action, especially if we put in the context all the social validation and everything that is around them of other people who are actually taking action. Vaccines only work if you have a critical mass of individuals. It's the same thing here, in the sense that you want people to know that there are others that are doing their job in becoming prepared and that they do not want to be left behind.
Be informed, practice, build a muscle for it, right?
That's
the
right.
Memory. Yep. Very good. We've been getting a few questions from the audience, so I'm going to jump right in and start with some of those. And this one is for Rawle. Relationships have been discussed at length to increase preparedness. How do you establish knowledge management programs when trained and connected individuals move on to a new or different position? That expertise may leave with them, and new relationships have to be established all over again.
That is a fair question, and I think we have to build redundancy. Disaster management is a team sport, and that as much as you need to know what your role is and how to do that expertly, you really can't be successful as a team time over time unless you understand what the other person's role is too. And if everybody's doing their role, but there's some backup. World Series, one of the things that for baseball fans, if you're in the outfield, you're coming to back up the infield when they're making those plays at first or second or third base. A lot of times it's not really seen. The pitcher will run and help out at home plate, even though those aren't primary responsibilities. So I think we do have to understand what is the goal. All right, the goal is to figure out as quickly as possible what is happening, what is the disaster. And then it is to employ some of the principles Dr. Palma's talked about, because we know what the plan is, and we understand how to execute that plan based on what my role is. And if my role is the point of contact, I can't be the only person with my hand down when my phone's not charged up and everybody's trying to get in touch with me. I got to understand it. If I'm one of the drivers and I'm saying you got to drive, then I can't let my car not get serviced on a regular basis. I got yellow and red and green lights all over the dashboard. And that's not the car that's going to get us there. So I think that's part of the redundancy we want to build in.
Thank you. This one may be for all of us to talk about. Could you speak to the training, outreach, awareness programs that the PSAs are able to conduct with organizations like churches, colleges, and how these organizations availed themselves of that resource, perhaps? Yeah.
Yes, I think this is a crucial component of disaster preparedness. We are, at A&M, we have something called Disaster City, which tries to simulate some of the potential problems that might arise from fires to attacks to many different type of context. It's really difficult in these training opportunities to simulate the stress and the cognitive load that happens in the brain when we're actually in a real situation versus an exercise. But the important thing here is training, and building that muscle memory in the brain so that whenever something happens, people get into action almost automatically. We are working with this group to try to find ways in which we can exogenously manipulate the cognitive load so that, for example, we make the brain artificially busy to see how people make their decisions and to try to understand what are the trigger points of decision. And how can we improve the training materials, the training opportunities using eye tracking devices and using devices that will measure facial expressions and measure the stress via galvanic skin response, respiration rates, and so on, so that we can train individuals to go back to certain trigger points of information when they make the decisions in environments that simulate this high cognitive load where the decision making is compromised. Sometimes we're talking about making decisions in a very limited amount of time that may have profound consequences in people. And so it's crucial for us to continue to do this, to understand how different aspects of our neurophysiology of decision making affect our capacity of making those decisions, and how can we help to train the responders to be able to make the better decisions because they have been in those situations, because they've experienced that kind of potential problems in their brains.
Quickly, Mike, disaster management, again, a team sport, but it's a three-legged stool as well. What can the public sector do, or should they be doing? I credit what the District of Columbia, Hyattsville, Alexandria, and Arlington already are doing to help get folks better prepared. And you can reach out to those government municipalities to help bring trainings, a lot of times at no cost to outside organizations. Obviously, we're here at the Red Cross. Nobody does it longer or better than the Red Cross does. But the second leg of that stool is what can the private sector do? So we had a great panel that dated us up on the podium. And the nice thing about what business is doing is that most people don't live at the organization. They come to and from the organization. So if your people not protected, your clients don't have a chance. Your customers don't have a chance. Experience is the new brand. So if the home of your employees is unstable, how do you think your consumers are going to receive that treatment, that service, that product? And then the last one is, what more can I do personally to get better prepared, to get better armed? And so one of the things we started doing, Mike, 10 years ago, AARP started working with Operation Stand Down. And for many of you, you know Operation Stand Down is a veteran support activity. And that kind of devolved into some disaster management work. My group just happens to include Florida, California, Texas, and New York. So before Harvey, we didn't really have a coordinated approach at AARP, external facing or internal facing. But everybody was calling me every day. Then Irma, Maria, so forth and so on. So it became a part of my other duties as assigned to get into this work, even though I'm a Gulf Coaster by life. And I've weathered more than my share of hurricanes.
Yeah, it's about making it personal.
Yeah.
One of the questions that actually was directed to me, but probably applies for everyone, is regarding pandemic influenza social distancing. Relates a little bit to what you just talked about. How are you preparing your employees that have direct contact with the public? And it's interesting, I joined Leidos only 3 weeks ago. So, and even in that example, I've been with IBM and General Electric in my career, but every one of those companies, I would say, had a solid program for training employees as you onboard and all that. And I give kudos to Leidos because I just went through all that. And there's some basic things about dealing with health customers, right? When you come into a hospital and everything else. But we practice, the cleanliness, wash your hands, and all the basics that you can imagine. And we ensure that everybody is really well informed, especially all of our employees who basically spend their days with hospitals, clinics, doctors, even patients in some cases. So there's extensive training and awareness that we do, and we make them take that training on a regular basis to ensure that there is compliance.
So this protocol is still on my desk. I haven't signed off on it, but I have it and I brought it for your benefit, not even knowing that question was coming. So the first thing we're telling our folks, remain calm. Again, we're living with that composure thing. Before you render aid, because not every jurisdiction has Good Samaritan laws, ask the person if they need help. And then don't render aid unless you absolutely have to do so because they're at greater risk. If they need medical attention or believe you think they're non-responsive, the first thing to do is call 911. Don't hesitate to use the 911 tool. Don't move a person who feels or looks to be incapacitated, again, unless they would be in a greater risk if you don't do it. And then what you want to do is avoid all contacts with blood or any bodily fluids of any kind to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to harm while you're trying to render aid. And then finally, if you can get safely some identification from that person so you kind of understand who they are and whether they have contacts. All of you, after you leave here, will have a point of contact on your person. So I would not have to worry about rendering aid to any of you. But sometimes people go out and there's no way to identify them or who we should contact when they're out. And that could be at work, that could be at home, or that could be at play.
Thank you. Another question, since we're on a roll here. What can we do to protect houses of worship and religious communities from acts of violence? Very deep question, very important, and such a reoccurring crisis that we have here.
Well, you hate to have metal detectors at the doors of the chapel because whosoever will, let them come. But you still got to come through security. But I do believe that if you are in a house of worship and you don't have disaster protocols around evacuation and monitoring, we're probably not doing it right. I was in Pittsburgh, which is one of my states, 2 weeks before the most recent incident there a couple of years ago. And I was in a hotel at a forum like this with many of the congregants of that temple. And I didn't feel any more exposed there than I do here sitting here with you. And that was naive of all of us, that we were just there trying to share, trying to listen, trying to learn, trying to add value. So I don't think it's harmful or hurtful to the religious or the spiritual experience to know that you have some security on premises. And I think the faith leaders have an obligation in that three-legged stool, Mike, to make sure you're protected when you come inside the house of worship.
I think our lives are really shaped by our emotions. In fact, we change our behavior from our risk preferences to many other contexts in response to highly emotional situations. We ran experiments where we exogenously induce people with happiness, with sadness, with fear, and we observe how they change their behavior in response to these emotions. And so one of the beautiful things about this country in particular, it also came from Central America, is the freedom that people have to move around. Obviously, fear is a very powerful emotion, but whenever we give into some of these potential threats without going in our daily lives, doing what we like to do, whether that's going to church, whichever denomination we want to go, or going to a football game or so on, then we start to lose our identity of human beings. So one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that, yes, we have to try to have precautionary measures. So if you're attending church, make sure that you have some potential, I'm assuming that most people who go to church typically do not go just once, but they actually have been in that building for more than once, so you can actually have a plan of action. Where are you sitting? Where will you go if something happened? What will be your plan of action for your family? And you don't have to do this every time, but I have many friends in the military, and they tell me when I come into a room, the first thing I need to do is to see what am I going to do if a threat arises. And so the very simple things that you can maybe, just like you do in your house or a place at work, you may do a similar type of situation awareness of where you are, the individuals that are surrounding you, and what would be the plan of action that might reduce the risk of you being in the line of threat.
So be aware, make a plan, practice it.
and communicate that to your family.
with your
make
family.
Sure that I have 2 little boys, and so you need to make sure, we always, whenever we travel at a new place, we always tell them, if something happens, you see that big building there, you stay where you are, or go to this place. If we know something is going, if we get lost when we go to the Texas A&M football games, if we get lost, they know the column they're supposed to go to wait for us right there. And so just communicating to make sure that everybody's on the same page and do some of the similar issues that you're already applying in the context of other places.
Very good. We have maybe time for one question for the audience, or 1 or 2, and then we can wrap up the panel. So there's mics. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This has been really great. We have employees in international locations, so I'd love to know some advice on trying to get everybody in all these very dispersed countries on board with a standard plan.
That is a great question. Actually, my whole career has been international, and Leidos has got employees in many places I can't even tell you about because they're intelligence related. So we have very well documented and training that goes on for those employees that are in situations that require that connection and that urgent communication and all that. So my answer to that is a very well structured policy where we train the employees and we document the methods in which we're going to communicate depending on the actual event. Everybody who, before we approve travel, there is actually a checklist of things that we have to go through. For some of our employees, but most of them actually, probably all of them, even if it's a personal trip to a country, if you go to, I don't know, Korea or whatever it is, you have to get approval, and so that we know where you are in case something happens. We can at least assist and all that. So it's planning, awareness, information, and we have a well-documented process to do that. So
Everything that Mike said, but it's got to be intentional. So how many of you raise your hands if you're not in disaster management and on your standing meeting agendas, you have anything about disaster preparedness on the agenda? You've got to have intentionality about this, even if you're only spending 5 minutes on it every meeting. And I'm not talking about the Red Cross much needed disclaimer about what to do in case something happens. I'm talking about making sure we're triaging the issues appropriately. The other thing I will tell you, we're into our second MOU with FEMA at AARP. For the faith-based questions, they have a faith-based initiative. For the international employee, they have an international initiative. And because it's our government and we pay taxes, they're not going to charge you for that. So it doesn't make sense to know something's on the shelf because you were here, that you don't use it. But who we're really talking to, folks, are all these few empty chairs that are here, because those are the folks, as ambassadors, all of us, you and me, have to go back and make sure that that person who didn't come for, oh, it's too pretty outside on a 45-degree day, I'm not going to the basement of the Reagan building. Like, okay, I need you to get with me on this. Huddle up and let's go execute with excellence.
I want to mention something that is not related to this question, but I've heard a few people today say this information is here, it's available, and it's free. I want to mention something because I think it's quite interesting. Texas A&M is the land-grant institution, which means that we, in addition to education and research, we also have a very important outreach and extension program. Most of our extension programs are free. You know what happens when these programs are free? Most of the people who come, we have lower show-up rates, lower participation, and a lot of the people, when they do the evaluation, say, this is quite good. Now, we've actually run some of the same training, exact same people, same materials, and you charge, even if it's a very small token, like $50, and everybody say this was a great program because they had to pay for some of that information. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that.
Yeah. So we have one final question, and then we'll wrap up the panel. So.
I just want to know, as a resident, in the event, we're very cell phone dependent, and even if your cell phone is charged in the event of a major disaster, everybody's trying to call out or call someone. How, you know, it used to be a time if everybody tried to call, you couldn't get a signal. Is this improved now? And in the event that we don't even have power to charge our phones or whatever, what do we do? Because when we had this big power thing, I think they said a Radashio or whatever it was a few years ago, I was out of power for a whole week. And even the suggestion you have of keeping your car half full, because I was running around with everybody else trying to go to the gas station, and those things are electrically powered now, so we couldn't even get gas. But I'm concerned about this digital grid that we're dependent on. If that thing sinks and we don't have power in the home, how do you survive?
So it's not cheap, but the question, everything costs, right? The question is, what is the value? So what we have deployed in our field operation are satellite phones in areas where we think we have high risk for disaster, human or man-made, including California, Florida, Texas. And so look into those kind of battery-operated or satellite-operated devices. And you don't have to do anything more than once a month. We require our satellite holders to designate that they are there. Who's the person? Did you grab the bag on the way out of the office because we had 48 hours notice? And that you check that phone once a month to make sure it works. Because there's nothing worse than having the thing that could save your life or the person's life you love. And then when you go to it, you're like, I did everything Andrew said. I had my bag, I had my plan, I had my phone, and then the phone doesn't work. So have that, look into it. And you know, the nice thing about all these online purveyors, you can find something about any cost you want to pay with a price point you'll be okay with.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Palma. Thank you, Rawle.
Thank you.
It's been a great day.
Oh, good job.